Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri, your instructor for this course. And today what we are going to do is we are going to cover the material for Module 6. As you know, in Module 6, we covered two different topics. We covered Chapter 13, which is focusing on foreign policy analysis, and then Chapter 14 that focuses on what? On international organizations. And as you can see, probably you've already read them, they're actually interrelated. That's why we cover them both under the same module. Something else that I need to mention is that, as you probably noticed, now that we are finished with all the theory chapters, these chapters are a little bit easier to grasp. It's because they're dealing more with practical issues. You don't need to constantly conceptualize and think in terms of, okay, what's the theoretical complication of this one? What are the independent, dependent variables or something? What's the cause? What's the effect? What is this? What is that? So these are a little bit, easier to understand, but we certainly need it, to cover the concept and theories and methodology of our field before we get into these topics. So having said that one, I'm sure that you have seen my PowerPoint. I hope that, by me putting all those, visuals on the PowerPoints and everything makes it a little bit easier for you to, focus on that and hopefully to remember the material. And I'm hoping that as you're watching these videos, hopefully they're also have the PowerPoint on and then set it up in a way that, you can take notes and your notes are going to be organized for each one of the pages. Well, we're going to start with the first page of it, which is, actually technically would be slide number 2, but the first page of it, which I always put like learning, objectives. Is that right? So what are some of the things that you need to really remember from the material we cover? Well, one of it is basically in terms of summarizing the content of the chapter is focusing on the theoretical aspect of foreign policy. Okay, so we would cover that one. The next notion is how you conduct the foreign policy. So here we are talking about the difference between theory and practice. That, of course, it is a relationship between the two. And then last but not least, obviously, we're going to have a conclusion in this regard. Now, we also gain an understanding of the following things, like the different ways of thinking about foreign policy analysis. Different people think about it a different way, different organizations, bureaucracies, etc. We're going to talk about all of those different actors. So there are some major elements, and then that's what I wanted you to remember. Now, starting with slide number 3 here, I guess the major question is, what is foreign policy analysis? Is that right? Okay. Well, foreign policy analysis basically is a subfield of international relations. Okay. So international relation as the general field has a number of different, subfields. One of it is, foreign policy analysis. Another one is international organization, that here we are covering only one. We covered that whole topic in one chapter, but of course it's a very sophisticated chapter. There are classes about that, okay? And so this is whole subfield. Another subfield that in future we talk about is like international political economy, all right? So there are a lot of different subfields, and this is one of them. And then what I want you to, recall about this one is that the common tendency when we are dealing with the international relation writing is that people have a tendency, especially the realists, they have a tendency to assume a whole lot about the role of the state as the main unit of analysis. Is that right? So as you would see later on when our discussion is developing, you would see that, wait a minute, with the technological revolution and the development of the human societies, both domestically and internationally, seems like there's some changes right there. So when we do something like that, in fact, one, very constructive criticism of it is by basically focusing so much on states, sometimes they forget about the flesh and blood, people who are in that state. So yes, it's easy to see, for example, foreign policy of United States of America, foreign policy of Russia, foreign policy of China, foreign policy of UK, foreign policy of, Algeria, you name it, Afghanistan, etc., etc. So what we are doing is we are black boxing those countries. It's like the entire country has one particular behavior toward international community, but in reality, that's not the case. Is that right? What we need to remember is that the people who are working in that state for foreign policy, there are individuals who would have different ideas about things. And that's why I was just trying to emphasize the flesh and blood, people who are actually making those foreign policies. Okay. The next notion I want you to recall is that what makes foreign policy distinct in the field is emphasizing in the human being and human element, okay? Because that makes it different from in different countries. It would be different. Okay, the second slide associated with what is foreign policy analysis deals with, how far back this so-called scientific method of foreign policy analysis goes. Well, it goes back basically to 1950s, pretty much. In other words, we are talking about the period right after World War II, okay? And some of the very famous scholars who did, a lot of studies on that, and they did a lot of publication. One was Richard Snyder, and the other one was James Rosenow, okay? So from its beginning, what they call FPA, short for Foreign Policy Analysis, is that right? So FPA has been a multidisciplinary subfield in the, because it draws ideas from different fields. You're gonna see it very soon, is that right? We have borrowed in foreign policy analysis ideas from business, ideas from psychology, ideas from sociology, ideas from history, ideas from here, ideas from there. So you would see that one. And then one of the major debates in this subfield is what they call the structure agency debate. Is that right? Now, what is that structure agency debate? That is basically the debate between what is the role of an individual or what is the role of the environmental factor. Is that right? So with the role of the individual here, we can say from one hand, there is the emphasis on what they call human agency. Is that right? Or some people, they just refer to it for short as agency. So in other words, does an individual can make or break something or change the world, or whatever? Well, some people say yes. Look at Gorbachev. Is that right? I mean, but Gorbachev, the last president of Soviet Union, basically changed the world by pretty much ending, by he started with reforms, and then he ended up, basically leading to the demise of Soviet Union and the end of Cold War officially. That's the positive side. There are people who also play the negative side throughout human history, like Hitler. Is that right? He was able to change a lot of things too. Obviously, not in such a positive way, for humanity, because he killed so many people, started a war which was much worse than World War I. Is that right? So that is one aspect of what they call the agency or human factor. And then the other one aspect of it is that, well, humans are not just alone, and humans are basically constrained by the social and political and economic structure that exists. So in this case, structure is more important and humans are affected by that. On the other one, an agency, is that right? Individuals they're like free agents, okay? So that's what they call the structure, last one, environment, and as opposed to what? Agency. All right, now having said that one, let's look at some of the models associated with foreign policy making, Perhaps the most famous one, is that right, is what they call the rational actor. The rational actor model, in a way, a lot of the terminology of it, very frankly, has been pretty much borrowed from like business, okay, perspective. And then the idea right here is that individuals who make foreign policy are rational people. Now, how do we know somebody is rational? A rational person tries to maximize their benefit and minimize their cost. Now, when we say benefit, we are not just talking about materialistic one, is that right? It could be non-materialistic stuff. And when we say, for example, cost, we don't mean just necessarily in form of cash. It could be in form of time, it could be in form of effort, in terms of other things. Of course, you can translate it and say, oh, wait a minute, I put 10 hours right there and I'm worth maybe $35 an hour. So here we go. Let me give you a bill for it. Is that right? So you could translate it into that. But in some instances, those things, they really do not count. Here the notion basically is that the actor follows a common course. And what are these common courses? They have to basically follow at least three steps. Number one is they need to identify what is the strategic problem that they're dealing with. Is that right? Is that a major security issues that the country is facing? Or is this like an opportunity to use something here and there and get some extra benefit for your country or not? The second one is to determine the possible option. For anything that happens to your country or the opportunity, there are what? Different options you have. For example, the simplest option would be just do nothing. In public policy, they call it the do nothing option, okay? And then the maximum would be do everything you can. So we go from one extreme to what the other extreme. Of course, most countries, they try not to go for the extreme cases. They try to choose some, options in between. Is that right? Usually we say, oh, the third option, which is somewhere in between. But in reality, to be honest with you, there are a lot more than the, just third option. Usually there's a fourth, fifth, whatever, and between those two extremes, of course, we talked about. And last but not least is they compare each one of these options in terms of what we call cost benefit. Is that right? Okay. Option number one, what are the costs of it? What are the benefit of it? Option number two, what are the costs of it? What are the benefit of it? By the way, this is known as cost benefit analysis. And again, this term has been borrowed from what? From business. Is that right? So this is a model that they borrowed from that one. Now, what are some of the criticism of this system? Or model, better to say. They say, I guess the first one comes in form of a question, and the question would be, are all actors always rational? Is that right? Like, for example, you could say that when we were putting pressure on Saddam Hussein, to say, okay, do you have any kind of, weapons of mass destruction and everything? And he was playing the role of, oh yeah, well, I'm not sure. He was playing around. Is that right? Was he really acting rationally? Or was an irrational behavior? Because he could have said, you know what? Why don't I invite IAEA, the United Nations Agency for what? Atomic, basically energy and development and everything else. Come to my country, bring all your inspectors, go wherever you want, and then you would see that I'm not developing what? Nuclear weapon, He decided not to choose that option. Okay, so some people said, well, look, he didn't choose that option and he forced his country into war. Is it really logical or not? So those are some of the things that you need to think about. I'm not suggesting he was or he was not. I'm just presenting ideas so you think about it. Okay. There's also the whole idea that is this model of rationality too Western-centric, too Western-oriented? Is that closer to our way of thinking in the West? Is that right? Because different way of group of people with different cultures, they could look at it as completely different ways. You see, that's possible. All right. Another model, for foreign policy analysis is what they call the organizational process model. What does this one mean? Basically, the model argues that governments, not a unitary actor, is making this decision. And in that regard, a government is basically a combination of not just one, but a variety of different groups and organizations and departments and agencies. Is that right? Like, for example, let me tell you what generally people think about our, decision making. People have a tendency to think that, okay, our DOD or Department of Defense, when, the representative of the DOD or Secretary of Defense comes to the cabinet of the president and there is a crisis and the president is asking, okay, Mr. Secretary of Defense, what do you think? So they think that usually the DOD comes out with kind of like a gun-ho approach. Let us go and, we take care of it for you. Is that right? That's a general approach, okay? That's not necessarily true, though, but, I'm just trying to simplify it for you. And then they think that, usually Department of State, is that right? Secretary of State representing Department of State, which is basically in charge of diplomatic relationship, et cetera, has come over there and emphasizes what? Emphasizes diplomacy. So one is supposed to emphasize diplomacy, the other one is supposed to emphasize what? Brute force or something. And then there are, of course, agencies, intelligence agencies, each one of them, they come with different type of information, etc. The bottom line right here is different organizations present what? Their information in what? Very, very different way. Considering their own, how should I put it, organizational, bias, for lack of a better term. So, and here the whole idea is that while, leaders are important, they depend on information. Is that right? And in fact, you remember that we have said these things before, that in political science, we consider information as power, okay? Because you have information, you can make better decisions. You don't have information, you're confused. You don't know what to do or whatever. So information is power, and this information coming from different agencies, it comes out with what? It's not just pure fact. They present the fact along with their what? Opinion, okay? So a criticism of this particular model has been that does it really underestimate the importance of individual as opposed to the organizations? Okay. Now, Any other model? Yes, there is also a bureaucratic model, and I want to make sure that you guys do not confuse the two because it's not an organization, you know what, bureaucratic. Well, this model, like the previous one, recognizes the role of multiple actors. Is that right? It's just not one person or something within the government. But it gives more weight to the what? To individuals who are over there and making a what difference. So and they're also, it's not just the individual themselves, but also the competition between these individuals. So like the competition between Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, head of the CIA, head of NSA, National, security agency, or DIA, Defense Intelligence, because all of these individuals are supposed to help the president and other elected officials to what? To make the right decision. Is that right? So this is very important. Now, from this perspective, or bureaucratic perspective, sometimes policy making has been, described like a game. Okay, it's a game that we play. So what are the rules? How do you play it? What do you do? What don't you do? What are some of the criticism of this one? In this one, we can say it does underestimate the importance of the leaders on the top. Is that right? Because it puts a lot of emphasis on the bureaucracy and not enough on the what? On the leaders. And what about outside actors? These events, they do not happen in a vacuum. Is that right? They happen in what? In a context. The next model I want you to remember is the what? Social, constructivism. Well, so what does this one suggest? This approach basically highlights the way in which what we call non-material or social values and practices influence and constrain actors' behavior. Is that right? So now remember, constructivists have always been interested in values, have been always interested in norms, you see? So that's why they give it a priority. So it would be, an example of that would be, for example, the whole notion of military intervention. Is that right? Should we or shouldn't we? And that really depends on how a society and the leaders of a particular country, they perceive that. Is that right? They might say, wait a minute, it's not our place to do military intervention because it's a domestic issue of another country. We are not. Do we like them to intervene in ours? Whatever. And some people say, no. We cannot just let this one happen. There is a travesty going on in another country. People are getting persecuted and everything else. We cannot, as humans, just sit here quietly and just ignore it. So those are the things that what we need to consider. Also, equally, other policy options may be difficult to understand based on what? Based on social values. So values are the key issue. The next model is the feminist model. And here, it's very interesting because it presents such a different view of things. So feminist approach, for example, asks whether or how gender makes a difference to foreign policy decision making. Now, one of the things I think they present, which is very interesting for me as a political scientist, is not just the answers, but even the questions they're asking. Let me tell you three of the major questions they're asking. One is, for example, do women use different strategies in decision making? That's an interesting one. Is that right? So we're conducting research and see, okay, what do men do when they're in power? What do women do? Another interesting question. Do they tend to support different policies? Interesting. Is that right? And last but not least, does their involvement, women's involvement, lead into a different type of outcome? Well, all three of these are very interesting. And notice that your chapter goes into details about each one of them. I'm not going to go and cover all the details because that's what you need to read. Is that right? I'm basically, as always, highlighting the main point, trying to make sure that there is a big picture and then, just like a jigsaw puzzle. Is that right? And I do not know if your family did the same thing or not, but when we were kids and during Christmas time and everything, holidays, my dad used to get these huge jigsaw puzzles, and my siblings and we used to get together and put those those little pieces together. So the first thing we do, as you know, what do you do when you have a jigsaw puzzle? You try to, they say, let's do the corners, okay? Well, in political science, they don't call it corners, we call it structure. So you do the structure, so you have some ideas. Of course, you have some kind of plan right there, either in your mind. Sometimes they provide you with a picture of it, sometimes they do not. Usually they do. At least the cover shows that what it's supposed to be, is that right? First you do that one, and then after that, all those other pieces, you have an idea like where it goes in relationship to that, structure or so-called corners. Is that right? Okay. Now, let's talk a little bit about the conducting foreign policy, and that's important as well. So foreign policy researchers, they usually use both qualitative and quantitative method. Some of them use numbers a lot. I know some of you people do not like it because I get all those emails. Oh, Dr. Sadi, I read such and such article. There were too many numbers in it. And the reason I decided about political science is because I was trying to stay away from numbers. Well, I have a news for you guys, okay? Even in our field, numbers are coming from different ways. Is that right? And don't be afraid of them. Is that right? There's a way to manage it. Okay, what else? Then another thing is there's sometimes specific methods. 4 famous methods in that regard are, one is archival research. This is when a scientist goes to a particular archive, and over there they study, let's say for example, they wanted to, how, for example, George Shultz as a secretary of state for President Reagan was making his decisions. Is that right? They can go to all those years when he was. How did he do it? Read the letters, read the documents. How he thought. So that would be one. Another one is what we call content analysis. So here, in fact, I was involved when I was a graduate student with one of the professors, Professor Michael Sullivan in University of Arizona. He was doing that type of analysis, and he would ask me, okay, what I want you to do is just look at the speech. And he would get me usually to look at State of the Union speeches of the presidents, and then he would give me like a list of the keywords, like for example, how many times did they use war? How many times did they use peace? How many times did they use democracy? How many times did they use justice? So you look at those things and you see, for example, oh, one president is using it more than another one uses something different. So content analysis. Next one is interview, which is something that actually, when I go to the field, as you know, I'm one of those political scientists that it doesn't just isolate himself in a library. Is that right? I actually go to my area of specialization, which is former Soviet republics and the Middle East. So I go over there, talk with people. Is that right? Interview with them. That's one. And then last but not least is what we call focus group, that I've been sometimes member of focus group. For example, U.S. Central Commands or State Department or something, they invite some of the well-known people in that particular country or region or something, and they ask us to express our ideas about something like that. So these are all different type of research. Now, what are some of the FPA key elements? So the key elements, one is actors, 2 is structures, 3 is the domestic and global what context. So let's start by what? By saying a few words at least about actors. With your permission, I drink a little bit of water now. Okay. So what did we talk about? See, here in terms of actors, it's not like one group, is that right? There are basically like 5 different groups. One is political leaders of the country. The other one are advisors. Next is the civil servants. Next is the non-state actors, and we've done talk about this. And last but not least, what? Media. Okay. And I'm not going to go to each one of these in details because your book, I thought, has done a pretty good job. That's pretty straightforward. So let's put our emphasis on some of the areas that is a little bit more challenging, okay? So what about in terms of the structure? In terms of the structure, this is, focuses on how you look at something. In other words, your perspective. So your perspective, then it depends on some of the thoughts that, and the theories that we already covered. Like, for example, realist. Is that right? They would look at the world like it's an anarchical international system. It's full of disorder, Be careful. Next one, feminist. They look at it as it's very patriarchal, It's very much masculine. It's focused, dominated by men. And then Marxists, they would say, well, it's dominated by capitalists. Is that right? They're all profit-oriented or exploiting what? The labor, blah, 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 Okay. And then what about the constructivists? They said, let's look at the social values. Let's look at the what? Some of the practices. Okay. So we covered those things. Now, what about the third element, which is the domestic context? Remember domestic and foreign policy context? So the domestic context basically talks about what? A number of issues. One would be the government institutions. So here we are talking about is the presidency and parliament going together and agree with the same policy options or no? There are 2 different poles. Is that right? Then there is the electoral system, and here they are basically talking about as a result of election in this country, has there been any kind of like a one party completely controlling, so it's speaking with so-called one voice? Or is that the coalition party? Then each one of the groups that are in the coalition, they have their own agenda, of course. Is that right? That's why they're a separate party. That's another one. Next one is public opinion. And you might say, well, how does public opinion affect? Well, public opinion affects, I mean, just think about it. Like when we think about the Vietnam War, is that right? When public opinion changed about the Vietnam War, that's when we started actually so-called losing. Is that right? Because when you think about each one of the battles, technically, even the Tet Offense, which our military was pretty surprised by this Tet Offense of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. Eventually, by the end of it, from a military perspective, they won. So how we lost this war was not in the field. It was basically in public opinion of the U.S. 58,000, body bags coming to U.S. People that didn't want their children to go to a foreign land that they didn't care about, is that right? And die or come back, not in one piece. Or come back like my Uncle Steve, who was a helicopter pilot, is that right? He came back supposedly in one piece, is that right? But I hated when I was a kid, I hated going to his home, for sleepovers with my cousins because middle of the night he would wake up, he would shout, he had nightmares and everything. And eventually, a few years ago, really many years ago, he died of suddenly brain cancer or something that they thought it had something to do with what Agent Orange that they were using in the area. Anyway, just opinion, so it's very important. And the last but not least is sometimes people, they refer to it as a diversionary theory, which means that sometimes it's used in the domestic politics to divert people's public's attention to something else. All right, what about the global context of it? In terms of global context, we need to consider that it could be, when they say global, I think authors, they don't just mean global, they really mean international, okay? Because they should say something international and then they can subdivide it into, if it's international, could it be regional, which means that countries around you, or could it be global, that means the whole world, is that right? That's what I really meant to do. And I actually wrote to publisher about that one. That's a little bit confusing for students. Don't say global over there and then come back and say global this, global that. Is that right? You need to specify what you mean. You really mean international. Anyway, so here are, of course, global and regional organization. Like global organization would be like the UN, regional organization would be like what? Like, NATO, or for example, or others. Then there is also the international law, which, by the way, we're going to talk about it, in the next chapter. And then what else? Then we also focus on what? We also then focus on global actors, and here by global actors, we do not, we mean both, profit-oriented and non-profit. Is that right? Profit-oriented could be multinationals or something. Non-profit would be terrorist groups. Is that right? Terrorist groups are not trying to make a profit. They're just trying to, or sometimes they call also liberation movements. Is that right? They basically want either their own state or they want to change a policy or something else. Anyway, so these are some of the things that we needed to cover to have a better understanding of foreign policy making, not just in theory, but also in practice. And as usual, I'm hoping that you digested the material. If not, feel free to send me a email and ask me. And if your questions are going to be very complicated or something to answer in one email, is that right? Because not all the questions can be answered in 1 or 2 sentences. Let me know, and what we do is we set up a time. We would have a Zoom session, or if you're here on campus or something, we make an appointment. You can come and see me, and you've seen, people coming always to my office hours and going, and so that would be something else we can do. All right. I want to make sure that you really digest the material, so you would be always ready for the next quiz, next exam. All right. Thank you so much. You take care. All right, and looking forward to continue to working with you. Bye bye.